Hi there. Today we are going to talk about the sexual abuse of women religious. It's a sensitive topic, but I do think that we have to address it. By the way, I am Carlene de Mazure and the director of the Center for Safeguarding Minors and Vulnerable Persons at St. Paul University, Ottawa, Canada. So let's share my screen. First of all, we need a definition of what is sexual abuse, because we cannot use just like that a definition that we use for our children. So let's have a look at it, because now we have to deal with adults. Sexual abuse occurs when an individual with inferior maturity or strength is tricked, trapped, coerced, or bribed into a sexual experience. It occurs if an individual who is impaired by disability, age, or situation is drawn into an activity that is sexually exciting for the abuser. However, the victim does not fully understand what is happening to her, or she is unable to give informed consent. The inequality of power between the victim and the abuser is crucial in the determining abuse. The inequality may be reflected in the older age, the size, the position, the experience, or authority of the abuser. And we will see that in certain situations, in many situations, in fact, priests are in such a position of authority, and they might, in certain cases, abuse this authority. So Sister Maura O'Donoghue was a member of the Missionary Sisters of Medicine, and as far as it is known, she was the first to alert the Vatican. She was in fact responsible for, she was a doctor, and she was responsible for looking at the HIV problem pandemic, we can say, in many countries. In fact, she visited 23 countries. So the documents that she wrote were written based on the visits of many countries in Africa, Asia, the Americas, and Europe as part of her role as AIDS coordinator for the Catholic Funds for Overseas Development. And finally, she had a list of 23 countries where women religious were HIV infected by sexual abuse by men, among whom priests are to be counted. If we look at the list, we see that it's not only about Africa, but Latin America, Europe, the United States, all are part of the list of the 23 countries. Another sister continued that research or this writing of reports, and it was Sister Mary MacDonald, missionaries of the Sisters of Our Lady of Africa, and she submitted a 4-page report to the International Union of Superior Generals and the Vatican office that oversees religious life with the following title: The Problem of the Sexual Abuse of African Religions in Africa and in Rome. And she treated the same topic. But here might be the reason why, in many cases, one is only talking about the sexual abuse of African sisters, while we know it's much more a large geographical area that is covered by abuse. So then Sister Esther Fangman spoke to 250 Benedictine abbots in the United States and Mexico, and she talked also about this same problem. And since the magisterium did not react, so the National Catholic Reporter publishes finally on 16th 2001 an online report with the title Reports of Abuse, and it was written by John Allen and Pamela Schaefer. So then the Holy See thought that they should react. And Joaquin Navarro Valls, the director of the press office of the Holy See at the time, said that the problem is known, but is limited to a geographically restricted area. We know that this is not true. it has been contradicted by the list of Sister O'Donoghue and by the research of Chitna, Wolf, and Ducrot that we are going to explore in a few moments, but also by a very recent research of Missio Aachen, Germany. So, but finally, the Vatican didn't ignore the problem anymore, nor that it was a very big problem and universal problem. And the Pope, for the first time, spoke on February 5th, on 2019. Pope Francis recognized the sexual abuse of nuns by priests and bishops, including a case in which some clergy used women as sex slaves. He said he was committed to ending this problem in the Roman Catholic Church, and that the Vatican had already taken steps in that direction. And we know of the publication of Vossestus Lix Mundi in 2019 that adds vulnerable persons to the group of possible victims, and vulnerable persons can also be adults. We had some other official reactions by women religious. First of all, the Leadership Conference of Women Religious of the United States. And they said that they did not have data on the incidence of sexual abuse by clergy of Catholic sisters in the United States, but that if the sisters have endured sexual abuse, they asked them to report the abuse to civic and church authorities and to seek appropriate assistance. The International Union of Superior Generals also had written a document, a declaration against any kind of abuse. And so they enlarge it. It's not only about sexual abuse, but all forms of abuse. And they say, we ask that any woman religious who has suffered abuse report the abuse to the leader of her congregation and to the church and civic authorities as appropriate. They, if the International Union of Superior Generals receives a report of abuse, they will be a listening presence and help the persons. Then another thing that has to be mentioned is that in 2019, the Vatican's women's magazine, Women, Church and World, at that time it was Lucrezia Scarafia who was responsible for the editing of this magazine. There was a large article in it that condemns sexual abuse of nuns by priests. And then again, we have a statement in February the 7th, probably because of the reading of the magazine. And they say that the sexual harassment and rape of Catholic sisters by priests and bishops has been discussed in meetings of leaders of orders of Catholic sisters from around the world for almost 20 years. But apparently the discussion has not led to solving the problem. So much more has to be done. Mostly it has been limited to give some formation to women religious, but there are two parties, and it might give the impression that the women religious are responsible for the abuse since they get a formation, and in many cases, priests do not get formation on that level, on that topic. So what could then be the causes of that kind of abuse? And the first is that we base our explanation on what we have seen till now, Sister O'Donoghue and MacDonald, and they say, well, you know, the sisters are safe targets if we look at AIDS, because since they have the vow of chastity, they are virgins, and so the priest cannot get contaminated with AIDS. And the second cause is that the fact that celibacy is often interpreted in a different way. It doesn't mean that they cannot have sexual relationships. It means that, in their explanation, that they cannot get married. And the fact that women are considered inferior to men in many cultures, and that they have learned to obey men, is very much a reason or a cause of the abuse. And they say themselves, the sisters, it's very difficult to say no to a man, especially if he is older and if he is a priest. There are some other courses. For instance, the recruitment of candidates. Often female religious congregations ask for a certificate of the priest of the parish that can tell them that the sister or the candidate sister is a good Catholic. But you see, this priest is at that moment put into a situation of power, and in some cases, they have asked for sexual favors in return for such a certificate. Sisters who are studying in another country are often very young and not well prepared, and they come in a place where they need help, and often they ask help, financial help and other help to a priest who is already there for a longer time. In that way, the priest gets power over the sister, and this might be an enabler for sexual abuse. Also, the reign of silence isn't helping to solve the problem. And even today, we see it's quite difficult to talk about sexual abuse of clergy, by clergy of the religious sisters. And then we have also to point to the vulnerability of diocesan congregations, because they fall under the bishop and the priest also. So in many cases, the bishop doesn't choose the side of the victim, because he might say, you have seduced him. And in many cases, he will protect the priest, and the sister might be sent away from the convent. That can be really a very big problem for the sister, because she really can have a vocation and she is re-victimized. Not only has she been abused, but secondly, she's sent away. We have been talking about research, and let's look at research and some reflections. What we see in the research of trauma experiences of Catholic nuns in the US in 1998, done by Chitna, Wolf, and Ducrot, we see that a lifetime prevalence of sexual abuse is almost 40%. So sisters have been, 40% have lived through the trauma of sexual abuse. During their religious life, it's 30%, because in this 40%, childhood sexual abuse is included. All type included, we see that the most frequent abuse is that of the laity, because child sexual abuse is part of it, as is work-related abuse. And that is for the laity is 46.7% of the incidents. But sisters can also be abused by other sisters, and that stands for almost 30%. And by members of the clergy, then it's 21%, and we don't know by whom they have been abused in 2.2% of the cases. If you take away child sexual abuse, then we know that the abuse by sisters to other sisters and of other sisters is 45%. By clergy, almost 30, lay persons 22, and unknown the same 2.2. So we see that there is abuse by clergy, members of the clergy, but also by sisters. Today, we are talking about the abuse by the clergy. If we put it a bit in a scheme, we say, yes, they are safe targets, but now there is not such a epidemic of AIDS anymore, and we see there are still sisters abused. So in fact, this AIDS epidemic brings to light something that had been going on for much longer, and it's going on for, hopefully not for much longer, but it's still going on. So there are power structures, otherwise you cannot abuse, and they are gender-related because they are dependent on priests, for instance, for finances, recommendations. In many cases, sisters have less education, and the spiritual and sacramental authority lies with priests. And there are structural issues as well. For instance, as we have said, the vulnerability of diocesan congregations. Then the research of Missio Aken in 2000, it was mostly Africa and India that they asked to complete a survey. And what do we see? So the reason, the causes for the abuse, patriarchal, clerical power structures or clericalism, we see in total 27 of the people have indicated that as a cause. They got 101 completed surveys. And then every time I put first Africa and then Asia. And you see that clericalism is considered to be a bigger cause in Asia than it is in Africa. The same is for shame and fear. It's much higher in Asia as considered to be a cause of abuse, and also the cover up or not disclosing the abuse. There are cultural norms and religious subordination, and that we see that Africa has pointed to 13 of the participants indicated that to be a reason, only 4 in Asia. The taboo of sexuality and abuse. And we know that in Africa, talking about sexuality is really a taboo. And so talking about abuse is even a bigger taboo. So we see that also in the numbers here. Lack of information, they don't know their rights, they don't know where to go. Can they denounce, can they disclose where to go? So that we see that Africa also has pointed that to be an important cause. And then the stigmatization of the victims. When victims, always victims, and maybe they are considered to be seducers and not victims at all. So there we see Asia has put 9, and Africa has 5 people who indicated that. And then the cover up, that's the same in the two continents. So what are the dynamics and why doesn't it come to light? I have compared that a bit with the reasons that we know for child sexual abuse. So children say that they are not heard, that they are not credible. So the women religious, in that case of abuse, they say, well, sometimes it's true, we are not heard, we are considered not to be credible, but if we are considered to be credible, they just listen and they do not act upon it. So no answers, no punishment, no changes. In both cases, there's a grooming process. It's meaning like preparing that the abuse can happen by seduction, by threats or something sometimes. But grooming is the preparing of the person, but not only of the person, also by the environment, because you have to take away the suspicion of the environment. And so we see that a grooming process for children, it's the child and its immediate family, while for religious sisters, it's the sister herself, but also her community. Because if they have suspicion, the community, or if the superior says you're not going with this priest, or you should not be alone with this priest, so the abuse will not happen. So the sister, the other sisters, as well as the superior, have to be groomed. They have to isolate the victim to have access to her. And so that happens with children. But this isolation of the victim is important for the perpetrator, because so the sister loses the support of her community. She's isolated because she can do all kinds of things with the priest that the others cannot. So there is jealousy, and bit by bit, she is not considered to be a good member of the community anymore, and she loses the support. So the stigmatization, children are held responsible in many cases, but that's even more the case with religious sisters. And then what are the cognitive distortions they use? Well, for children, it's things like, God put you on my way. And for religious, it is the meaning of celibacy. As I already indicated, they say it means not being married, sister, but you can go, we can have a sexual relationship, we love each other. The image of the priest, then, for children, he is on a pedestal, placed on a pedestal, he's seen, he represents Christ on earth, but that's quite the same for religious sisters, and they see him as infallible. Silence, the manipulation of the abuser, in both cases, but with children. But there is a topic that has to be added, namely the taboo and the shame not to talk about sexuality. And then what happens with a priest who has been accused? Well, in the case of sexual abuse of children, the priests are often transferred from one parish to another, and the same happens with religious sisters. So are the religious sisters vulnerable persons? Well, we can have a look at that, and what does Vos Estis Lux Mundi says. The definition of a vulnerable person is broad now to include any person in a state of infirmity, physical or mental deficiency, or deprivation of personal liberty, which in fact, even occasionally limits their ability to understand or to want to otherwise resist the offense. What is important here is that it can be temporarily, because not every sister is a vulnerable person. However, they can be put in a vulnerable situation. For instance, if they go for spiritual guidance, because then, or with a confession, because what happens then is that the priest knows everything about her, what gives him power, and she doesn't know anything about a priest, unless the things that are known just publicly. So I wouldn't call the whole group of religious sisters vulnerable persons, because look, if you are a superior general and the priest is a parish priest, you cannot say that the superior general is in a state of in a position of vulnerability. So, but it can happen that even for the superior general, that she is towards a priest or a bishop in a position or in a situation of vulnerability. So I wouldn't call the whole group vulnerable persons, but I would say that sisters in some situations, being alone abroad, needing a recommendation from the priest, having him as a spiritual director, that in those situations, the power balance is so asymmetric that the priest has the power to, that this power differential is an enabler of sexual abuse. Not everyone who is in power is going to abuse, but you need this asymmetry to be able to abuse. And the question is there consent? Because if there is mutual consent, if there is informed consent, then it's not abuse. So we just seen that sisters are not always in a vulnerable situation regarding to the priest. So is it possible that between a sister, a religious sister, and a priest, that there is a relation that is based on mutual consent? It is possible. And there are situations in which they both are present, and not from their positions as priests, such as parties or social gatherings with friends. The power differentials in these cases is small or even non-existent, and a sexual relationship may indeed be based on mutual consent. So what we see is that they transgress at least their vows. Or the celibacy promise, we can say. If they have this kind of relationship, then we can doubt about their choice for religious life. Maybe it wasn't the right choice for them. And second, women and priests may work together in a particular project, such as, for instance, in a school or in catechesis, and in as much as the priest does not have a hierarchical higher position, a sexual relationship between colleagues can be based on mutual consent. But the sister often will not feel well because she feels guilt because of the breaking of her voice. And the question is always asked by some of my students, whether it's possible that they are on equal that they're on equal terms, because they say in their culture, a priest is always in a situation of power because of the sacramental powers that come with his ordination. That is a topic that can be discussed. So the crucial question of consent, there are three situations. A third possibility consists in the fact that a woman finds herself in a subordinate position and is dependent on the priest, as for example, in a pastoral or spiritual accompaniment, or if she works under his authority in the parish. In this case, the power difference is such that mutual consent is not valid and any sexual relationship is abuse, because the responsibility always lies with the one in power. So if she gives her consent, the consent is not valid, because you have to be in a situation of liberty to be able to consent. And if you are dependent on someone, you are not, you do not have the freedom to refuse. So research, let's have a look at the research of Sister Mary Limbo, who did her research in sub-Saharan Africa. And we will cite her to talk about the consequences. And consequences, the worst are on the physical level is pregnancy. If you have sexual relationship, it's possible that you get pregnant. That's the nature of it. So in that case, there are two possibilities. Or the sister commits abortion, which is adding to the guilt she already has because she is taking life of a child. Or she will get the child, but then she will have to leave the convent. So she is re-victimized. Very often she's not welcome in her family because of the fact that she is pregnant and not a religious sister anymore, which is an honorable position. So being pregnant is really a big problem for the sister, even if she keeps the child. And we know about abortions, but if she keeps the child, also the pregnancy is very stressful because it's a not wanted pregnancy. And also that has consequences for the child. And then you have to educate a child that you did not want, and that is the consequence of an abuse. So this is a very delicate and different situation. Some are also hit because they refuse the sexual relationship, and then he uses force in order to have what he wants. And then they can also be deprived of the usual financial support if they do not want to do what he wants, and then they get hungry and get in a physical distress. There are also consequences on the psychological integrity. They feel a psychological pain that they cannot name very much in detail or describe. And they feel the weight of unexpressed anger because they are very angry about what happens to them or to her. And, you know, expressing anger is not something that in Catholic circles is very much appreciated. And so it's unexpressed anger because also she doesn't want the others to know that she has this sexual relationship. And then what weighs is very much the silence. But there is also a problem with the community integrity. They feel as they are not really part of the community anymore because they do not respect the rules. And they are very much afraid of the judgment of the sisters, who very much put the weight of the sexual misconduct on the consecrated woman and not on the one who is responsible for the abuse. They might say that she has seduced him and so on. But also the sister feels a fear that also other sisters might be abused of, might have a sexual relationship, as they call it, with the same man, which is not such an exception. It's not so extraordinary because we see that someone who transgresses once the rules, in many cases transgresses more than once, and have, even in the same community, have more than one sister that they are abusing. Social integrity. So She cannot do and move and go where she wants to because the priest is jealous about her and he wants to control, but because sexual abuse is also always an abuse of power. So he wants to monitor the relationships that she has. She should not talk to other priests. She should not talk to other men. And so he controls where she goes and with whom she is talking. And then the spiritual integrity. They have difficulty to pray. And if they want to pray, instead of seeing Jesus Christ in front of them, they see the image of the priest who takes all the place. So what can we do? Actions. What did the sisters say themselves about? Well, they want moral support and spiritual counseling. 38 say that. Africa and India, both, there are in both cases many sisters who say that. They want impartial listening, 18, 15, 35 of them. So not judging. They do not, if they talk to the bishop, for instance, they know in many cases he's going to choose the side of the priest. So no, not this kind of listening, but impartial listening. And they want legal support and prosecution for those who have abused. They should be punished. The introduction of accountability, independent commissions for investigation, because if it is the church itself who does the investigation, in many cases the victims are not heard or there is no action that is following their accusation. So they want an independent commission to take care of the investigation. They need financial support because the priest doesn't want to pay for them anymore or doesn't want to help them and their family anymore. And they also some ask also for psychological support and therapy. Africa didn't write that, and we see Pacific and international, the Pacific and international, so a few religious superiors also participated in the research. Those are the numbers of those sisters. So they want that we raise awareness, and they also want physical protection, because as we have seen, sometimes they are hit, they are threatened that they might be killed, that they will be beaten up. So they ask for physical protection, especially after they have denounced the abuse, and they want creation of networks. Let's go to the last slide. Many has to be done. First of all, the selection of priests. We need priests who are serious about their vocation and do not choose priesthood because it's a situation in which they are protected financially, having a good job, having respect from people. We need the selection of priests who have really a vocation. We have to look at the theology of priesthood to make sure that it is not an enabler of abuse to give them too much power, or a theology that says that celibacy doesn't mean that they cannot have sexual relationship. And we need respect for the sacrament of confession, because some abuse in the context of the sacrament, and others do not respect the seal of confession. We have to enter silence. Taboo and shame should not be part of talking about sexuality if it happens in a very decent and respectful way. The fear of damaging the institution, even Pope Benedict has already said that that is not a good reason to keep silent, because then the abuse goes further and the church is even more damaged. We have seen that with sexual abuse of minors, that the silence has enabled the abuse to go on and has given way to even more scandal. And the sisters should not be pressured by the bishops to keep silent. So developing procedure for reporting that are independent, and we need policies, and that should not be a too difficult problem because of the policies we already have for minors. So formation programs on both sides, not only the sisters. We also need formation on the sides of the priests about human rights, the meaning of ordination, education for women religious, of course, and a gender equality in the Catholic Church. So that this power of being a man should not exist anymore, but that there is an equality between men and women. Healing for those who are abused, and so that they can talk about it. So maybe opening a center of counseling or a hotline where they can talk to someone who has no power over them, not their own religious superior, not their bishop, but someone on a hotline who is independent and can listen without judgment. And justice has to happen. So there has to be accountability, and investigations have to be done by clergy as well as by laypersons. And anonymous reports should be possible, because after investigation we can see if they were serious or not. So thank you for listening. And I hope I give you some material to discuss with others and to realize that this is a group that we have to protect by right procedures, by right investigations, and by listening if someone of the group comes, of the religious, female religious, comes and say that they have been abused. It's our task as Christians, as Catholics, to serve the ones who have been hurt. Thank you.